The sound of my plane's engine dying over my own ranch was terrifying. But the real nightmare began when my neighbor decided to make it a public spectacle. The sound of a failing engine is a special kind of quiet. It's not the absence of noise, it's the presence of the wrong noise. It's the sound of gravity winning, the sound of your stomach trying to climb out of your throat. For me, that sound echoed over 1,000 acres of Texas dust and pride that I call my ranch. My plane, a Cessna 182, I affectionately called the Goose, wasn't a toy. It was a tool, just like my pickup truck or my tractor. It was how I checked the far-flung fence lines, spotted stray cattle before they became a coyote's dinner, and got to the nearest real town in under an hour instead of 3. The Goose and I were on a routine fence check along the northern perimeter when it happened. A cough, a sputter, then that terrible gut-wrenching silence as the propeller windmilled uselessly. I've practiced engine-out landings more times than I can count. Panic is a luxury you can't afford at 2,000 feet. I scanned the landscape below my landscape. I saw the dry creek bed, the flat pasture near Miller's Ridge. I picked my spot. A long, relatively smooth stretch of grassland I'd hayed just a few weeks prior. It wasn't going to be pretty, but it was going to be survivable. I keyed the mic. Mayday, mayday, mayday. November Golf, Charlie. I rattled off my position, my situation, and my intention to land on my own property. Then I focused on flying the brick. The landing was more of a controlled arrival. The landing gear caught in the thick grass and snapped clean off, sending the fuselage skidding on its belly with a deafening shriek of tearing metal. It felt like an eternity, but it was probably only 10 seconds before the Goose slid to a halt, nose down in the dirt. I sat there for a moment, the silence now absolute, broken only by the ticking of the hot engine and my own ragged breathing. A quick self-assessment. No broken bones, a nasty bump on my forehead where it met the panel, and an adrenaline high that could power a small city. I unbuckled, kicked the door open, and stumbled out onto my own land, staring at the wreckage of my trusted workhorse. It was a bad day, no doubt about it. A very expensive, very bad day. But I was alive. That's when I heard the screech of an ATV. It was Carol. Of course it was Carol. She'd bought the 30-acre plot bordering my northern fence line about a year ago, a city transplant who thought a country estate meant manicured lawns and complaining about the smell of cows. From day one she'd been a thorn in my side. She'd complained about the dust from my truck, the noise from my tractor at 6 a.m., and even tried to tell me my prize-winning bull, Hercules, was intimidating her poodle through 2 fences. Now she came roaring up on her pristine ATV, not a speck of mud on it, her face a mask of outrage. "What in the world do you think you're doing?" she shrieked, skidding to a stop a safe distance away. "Not. Are you okay?" "Not. Do you need help?" "No." Her first words were an accusation. I was still a bit dazed, wiping a trickle of blood from my forehead. "I had a bit of an engine problem, Carol." "An engine problem? You crashed a plane, here, right next to my property." She gestured wildly at the fence line, which was a good 200 yards away. "You could have hit my house. You could have killed my alpacas." I just stared at her. "Carol, I'm on my own land. I handle my own problems. I need to make a few calls, starting with the FAA." That was the wrong thing to say. Her eyes narrowed. She saw an opportunity not for help, but for drama. She whipped out her rhinestone-covered phone. "Oh, you'll be making calls, all right. I'm calling 911. This is a public menace, an aviation disaster." "Carol, don't," I said, my voice firm. "You'll be wasting their time." "There's no fire. I'm the only one involved, and I'm fine. This is a federal matter, not a local one. Let me handle it." She just smirked, pressing the phone to her ear. "Yes, hello? I need to report a plane crash. Yes, a full-on crash. It nearly hit my home. There's wreckage everywhere. I don't know if the pilot is stable. He seems agitated. Please send everyone." My heart sank. Everyone. I knew what that meant in our rural county. It meant the sheriff's department, the volunteer fire department from 2 towns over, and at least 1 ambulance. She was turning my controlled private incident into a public spectacle. Within 10 minutes I could hear the distant wail of sirens. They grew louder and louder, a chorus of unnecessary panic, heading straight for my pasture. The first sheriff's cruiser bounced over the field and skidded to a halt, kicking up a plume of dust. A deputy I'd known for years, a guy named Miller, jumped out, his hand resting on his sidearm, his eyes wide with alarm. He wasn't looking at me with concern. He was looking at me like I was a crime scene, and behind him I could see Carol standing by her ATV with a smug, triumphant smile, as if she'd just saved the entire state of Texas from my reign of terror. That's when I knew my day had just gone from bad to catastrophic. Deputy Miller held up a hand, a silent plea for calm that was immediately drowned out by the approaching sirens. "Just stay put, John," he said, his voice tight. "Let's figure this out." But there was nothing to figure out. I'd had an accident on my property. End of story. Except Carol had just turned my story into a high-stakes drama, and she was the star. A fire engine, a massive beast wholly unsuited for pasture land, came lumbering over the hill, its tires tearing deep ruts into the earth I'd so carefully tended. An ambulance followed close behind. Paramedics spilled out, running towards me with a stretcher and a neck brace, their faces grim with professional concern. "Sir, are you hurt? Don't move," one of them shouted. "I'm fine," I said, waving them off. "I've got a bump on my head and a bruised ego, that's it." They weren't listening. They were looking past me, at Carol, who was now clutching her chest and giving a frantic, teary-eyed performance to the other deputy who had arrived. "It came right over the trees," she wailed, pointing a trembling finger. "It was so low, I thought we were all going to die. The noise, it was like a monster." Miller sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "John, protocol says we have to get you checked out." "Protocol for what?" I shot back, my patience wearing thin. "A forced landing on my own ranch? You know me, Miller. You know I'm not some hotshot joyrider." "I do," he conceded. "But the 911 call reported a major crash with a potentially unstable pilot near a residence." He gestured towards Carol's ongoing theatrics. "We can't just ignore that." So I had to stand there feeling like a fool, while a paramedic shone a light in my eyes and took my blood pressure, which was, understandably, through the roof. Meanwhile, the firefighters were unspooling their hoses. "What are you doing?" I demanded. "There's no fire. The master switch is off. The fuel line is cut." The fire captain, a man I usually shared a beer with at the county fair, shrugged apologetically. "Can't be too careful, John. We've got a fuel spill. We've got to foam it down." "It's a leak, not a spill. You'll ruin what's left of the engine," I protested, but it was useless. A thick blanket of white chemical foam began to cover the goose, seeping into every crevice, turning my salvage operation into an environmental cleanup. They started wrapping yellow tape around the wreckage, then expanded it, creating a 100-yard perimeter. They were taping off my own land, treating it like a crime scene, and I was being held outside the line. Through it all, Carol was the director. She pointed out the flight path, a complete fabrication that had the plane banking sharply over her alpaca pen. She described how I was flying erratically for at least 10 minutes before the crash, swooping and diving like some kind of barnstorming maniac. It was a masterpiece of fiction, delivered with the conviction of a true believer. Miller took her statement, his pen scratching dutifully across his notepad. He'd occasionally glance over at me, a flicker of doubt in his eyes. He knew my reputation. I was meticulous, safe, a pilot who treated the sky with the same respect he treated his land. But Carol's story was detailed, emotional, and damning. Finally, after an hour of this circus, things quieted down. The paramedics had cleared me, the firefighters had emptied their tanks, and Carol had finally run out of dramatic new details to add. Miller walked back over to me, his expression unreadable. "All right, John. The FAA investigator is on his way from Austin, but it'll be a few hours. The NTSB has been notified, too." "Good," I said, relieved. "They'll see the engine failed. They'll pull the data. They'll see my flight path was straight and level until the stall. They'll clear this whole mess up." I started to walk towards my truck, which my ranch hand had brought down. "I'll just head back to the house and wait for their call." Miller put a hand on my arm, stopping me. His grip was gentle but firm. "You can't do that, John." I stared at him. "What do you mean, I can't? This is my property." "It is," he said, his voice low. "But it's also a potential federal investigation scene now. And Mrs. Peterson, he nodded towards Carol, who was watching us with narrowed, victorious eyes, has made some very serious allegations. Allegations? Miller, she's a known hysteric. She once called the sheriff's office because a barn owl was looking at her funny. I know, he sighed. But she alleged reckless endangerment. She gave a sworn statement that you intentionally flew low over her house, putting her and her property in jeopardy. She even claims you were buzzing her, and that this crash was a result of your reckless stunting. Because of that specific allegation, we can't just treat this as an accident. He let the words hang in the air for a moment before delivering the final blow. Until the federal investigators get here and officially take over the scene, you're to remain here. And John, I'm sorry, but I have to read you your rights. My world tilted. Being read my Miranda rights, standing in my own pasture next to the carcass of my plane, was a level of surreal I'd never imagined. Miller looked miserable doing it, but he was by the book. Carol, on the other hand, was positively beaming. This was better than any reality TV show she could stream. She had created this drama, and she was lapping it up. I spent the next 3 hours sitting on the tailgate of my own truck, a de facto prisoner on my own land, watching deputies take pictures and measurements as if I were some kind of criminal. The FAA investigator, a no-nonsense man named Peterson, finally arrived late in the afternoon. He was followed shortly by a team from the NTSB. They weren't like the local responders. Their movements were precise, quiet, and professional. They surveyed the scene, largely ignored Carol, who tried desperately to get their attention, and came straight to me. Peterson listened intently as I recounted every detail of the flight, from the pre-flight check to the moment the prop stopped spinning. He made notes, asked a few pointed questions about maintenance logs and fuel, then walked over to the plane. For hours they worked. They documented the snapped landing gear, the angle of impact, the state of the control surfaces. They pulled the engine data recorder, a small hardened box that held the digital truth of my last flight. Peterson came back to me as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the Texas sky in shades of orange and purple. "Your story checks out, Mr. Hayes," he said, his tone flat and professional. "Engine data shows a catastrophic failure in the number 3 cylinder. Your flight path was straight and level, and your mayday call was textbook. Based on your altitude and the terrain, you picked the best possible spot to put her down. Good flying." A wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled my knees washed over me. "Thank you. Can I go home now?" Peterson nodded. "As far as the FAA is concerned, this was a mechanical failure. We're done here. We'll send a full report." He then turned and looked over at Miller, who had been patiently waiting. "Sheriff, my initial findings show no evidence of pilot error or reckless endangerment. The claims of buzzing are inconsistent with the flight data. This was an emergency landing." Miller nodded, looking relieved himself. He walked over and formally undetained me. "Sorry for all this, John." "It's not your fault, Miller," I said, my gaze shifting to Carol, who was now looking decidedly uncomfortable. The federal agents were packing up their gear, and her audience was leaving. Her show was over. She started to slink back towards her ATV, but Peterson wasn't quite finished. "One moment, ma'am," he called out, his voice carrying an authority that made Carol freeze in her tracks. He walked over to her, followed by Miller. "Mrs. Peterson, is it?" "It's Miss Carmichael," she corrected, puffing out her chest. "Right," Peterson said, consulting his notes. "Miss Carmichael, your 911 call reported a crash that nearly hit my home and a pilot who was unstable and flying erratically. You gave a sworn statement to the sheriff's department alleging the pilot was intentionally buzzing your property. Is that correct?" "Yes, it was terrifying," she insisted, though her voice lacked its earlier conviction. "Ma'am, knowingly making a false report to emergency services is a misdemeanor. However," Peterson's voice became colder, sharper, "knowingly providing false information to federal investigators during the course of an NTSB investigation is a felony. Furthermore, every emergency vehicle that responded today, the sheriff's deputies, the ambulance, the fire engine from 2 counties over-incurs a cost. When a response is triggered by a false or malicious report, the reporting party can be held liable for the full cost of that response." Carol's face went from pale to ghostly white. The color drained from her cheeks. I I was just scared. I thought—" "You thought you saw an opportunity," Peterson cut her off. "You turned a standard emergency landing into a five-alarm circus. You interfered with a pilot managing a critical situation. You tied up emergency resources for hours. And you made false allegations that triggered a federal investigation." He handed a card to Miller. "Sheriff, my office will be forwarding our findings, including the flight data that proves Ms. Carmichael's statement was fabricated. We will be recommending the U.S. Attorney's Office pursue charges for making a false report to federal authorities." He then looked back at Carol. "And the county will be sending you the bill for the emergency response. Given the man-hours and equipment, I imagine it will be in the tens of thousands. Have a good evening." He turned and walked away. The silence that followed was deafening. Carol just stood there, her mouth agape, looking from the sheriff to her ATV to the wreckage of my plane. The smug satisfaction was gone, replaced by the dawning horror of actual, severe consequences. Miller just shook his head and scribbled a final note. I didn't say a word. I just got in my truck, started the engine, and drove back to my house. The next morning, as I was drinking my coffee and looking at the first bill from the salvage crew, I saw a for sale sign go up on Carol's 30 acres. Turns out the country wasn't quite the dramatic stage she thought it was. It has rules too, and sometimes they bite back a lot harder than a prize-winning bull.